There is a moment that reveals everything about a person. Something unexpected happens. An insult, a betrayal, a small humiliation. And you see what happens inside them before they have time to compose a response. Some people get hijacked completely. Their mood, their thoughts, sometimes their whole day, decided by something that lasted 10 seconds. Some people don't. They feel it. It's real, but it passes through them instead of consuming them. Most people call this temperament. Some people are just calmer. Carl Jung would say that's wrong. What you're seeing isn't a personality trait. It's the result of internal work. Work most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Today we go into that work. Stay until the end. The final practice is the one Jung considered the foundation of everything else. 1. Why you are not actually reacting to what you think you're reacting to. This is where we have to start, because almost everything else depends on understanding it. When something happens, someone criticizes you, dismisses you, betrays you, disappoints you, you experience the reaction as a direct response to that event. They did this, so I feel this. It feels obvious. Causal? Simple. Jung's most disruptive insight is that this is almost never the full story. What actually happens is more layered and far more revealing. The external event is real, but the intensity of your reaction to it is rarely proportional to the event itself. It is proportional to something the event has touched, a wound, a fear, an old story, a part of you that was already raw before this person ever said a word. This is why two people can experience the exact same criticism and have wildly different reactions. One barely registers it, the other is destabilized for days. The criticism was identical. What differed was what was already present beneath the surface, waiting to be activated. Jung called this activation a complex, an emotionally charged cluster of memory, belief, and feeling that sits beneath conscious awareness, waiting for a trigger that resembles its original wound. When that trigger arrives, even in a completely different context, even from a person who has nothing to do with the original wound, the complex activates as if the original event were happening again. This is why a comment about your work can make you feel like you did at 8 years old when a parent told you that you weren't good enough. The boss is not your parent. The situation is not the same. But the complex doesn't know that. It responds as if it is. You are not reacting to the present moment. You are reacting to the present moment through the lens of an old, unhealed wound that the present moment happened to brush against. And until you can see this clearly, until you can recognize when a reaction is disproportionate to its trigger, you will remain at the mercy of every situation that happens to touch an old wound you don't even know you're carrying. 2. The shadow, and why what you refuse to see in yourself controls you. This is Jung's most famous concept, and also the most consistently misunderstood. The shadow is not simply the bad parts of you. It is everything about yourself that you have refused to consciously acknowledge, which can include both what you consider negative and, surprisingly, qualities you consider positive but were never allowed to express. Anger you were taught was unacceptable. Ambition you were taught was arrogant. Need you were taught was weak. Sexuality you were taught was shameful. Even joy sometimes. If joy was punished or dismissed in your early life, these parts do not disappear because you stop looking at them. They go underground, into what Jung called the personal unconscious. And from there, they do not become powerless. They become more powerful, because they now operate outside your awareness, influencing you without your knowledge or consent. Here is the mechanism that matters most for our purposes today. The things in your shadow are the things that affect you most violently when you encounter them in other people. If you have buried your own anger, someone else's anger will destabilize you disproportionately. If you have buried your own ambition, someone else's confident ambition will provoke a reaction in you that has nothing to do with them and everything to do with what you've refused to let yourself be. If you have buried your own need, someone else's vulnerability will make you deeply uncomfortable, sometimes contemptuous, in a way that reveals more about your own unintegrated need than about them. This is why certain types of people get under your skin in ways that seem disproportionate to anything they've actually done. They are not the cause of your reaction. They are activating something you have exiled from your own awareness. Jung's demand here is uncomfortable but precise. The thing that triggers you most intensely in other people is almost always a map directly to your own shadow. Not always, but far more often than people are willing to admit. And the person who has done the work of integrating their shadow, of consciously acknowledging the parts of themselves they used to refuse, becomes, almost as a side effect, far less reactive to the same qualities showing up in other people. because there is no longer a hidden, exiled part of themselves being threatened by the resemblance. 3. Projection, and why other people are often a mirror you didn't ask for. This concept follows directly from the shadow, and it explains something that confuses almost everyone about emotional reactivity. Why does this specific person bother you so much? Jung's answer, often, is projection. Projection is the unconscious process of attributing to another person qualities that actually belong to your own unrecognized psyche. When you cannot tolerate something in yourself, your mind does something remarkable. It locates that quality outside of you, in someone else, and then reacts to it there instead. This is not a conscious choice. It happens automatically, beneath awareness, and it feels, from the inside, completely real. The person who cannot tolerate their own insecurity will often perceive insecurity in others and react to it with contempt that seems disproportionate to anything the other person actually did. The person who cannot tolerate their own selfishness will be hypersensitive to selfishness in others, seeing it everywhere, reacting to it intensely. The person who has never allowed themselves to want things will be irrationally irritated by people who want things openly and unapologetically. This is why the same behavior in different people produces wildly different reactions in you. Your friend's confidence might inspire you. A stranger's identical confidence might irritate you intensely. The behavior is the same. What differs is what that behavior is touching in your own unconscious material, and whether you've made peace with that material or are still fighting it. Jung's instruction here is one of the most demanding in his entire body of work. Before you trust your reaction to someone, ask honestly, is this entirely about them? Or is some portion of this reaction actually mine, projected outward and experienced as if it belongs to them? This question, asked consistently, over years, begins to dissolve an enormous amount of unnecessary reactivity. Because much of what destabilizes us is not actually coming from outside. It is coming from inside, mislabeled as external, and then experienced as if someone else is doing something to us that we are in fact doing to ourselves. 4. The persona, and the exhausting cost of managing how you are seen. Jung identified another structure that contributes enormously to emotional fragility. The persona, the social mask we construct to navigate the world, to be accepted, to fit the role required of us in different contexts. The persona is not inherently bad. Jung was clear about this. Some version of social adaptation is necessary and healthy. The problem arises when a person becomes so identified with their persona that they forget it is a mask at all. When the professional identity, the confident exterior, the put-together image becomes, in the person's own mind, the entirety of who they are. Because here is what happens to a person in this state. Anything that threatens the persona feels like an attack on their actual existence. A criticism of their professional competence doesn't just sting, it feels like an existential threat, because their entire sense of self has been invested in that competence being unquestioned. A challenge to their carefully maintained image of being put together produces a reaction wildly disproportionate to the challenge itself, because the image has become load-bearing for their identity. This is why people who seem the most confident on the surface are sometimes the most fragile underneath. Because the confidence is the persona, not the actual self, and any crack in the persona threatens to expose what's beneath it. The person who is rarely affected by anything has typically done something specific here. They have separated their sense of self from their persona. They understand that the professional mask, the social role, the public image, these are useful tools for navigating the world, but they are not who they actually are. So when the mask is criticized, when someone attacks the professional image, the social standing, the carefully constructed exterior, something underneath remains untouched. Because the part of them that matters most was never invested in that exterior, holding up perfectly in the first place. 5. Individuation, Jung's term for the actual goal of all this work. This is the central concept that everything else in Jung's psychology orbits. Individuation is the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, beneath the persona, beyond the unconscious patterns, integrated rather than fragmented. It is not the same as individualism. It is not about becoming more separate from others or more self-centered. It is about psychological wholeness, the integration of conscious and unconscious, of shadow and light, of the parts of yourself you've accepted and the parts you've exiled. And here is why this matters so directly for our subject today. A person who is fragmented, whose conscious self is disconnected from large portions of their own unconscious material, is structurally unstable. There are too many hidden triggers, Too many exiled parts that can be activated without warning. Too much material operating outside of awareness, capable of hijacking the conscious mind at any moment. A person who has done significant individuation work, who has consciously integrated more of their own depths, has fewer hidden triggers, not none. Jung never promised completion. Individuation is a lifelong process, not a destination. But fewer, and the ones that remain are at least known, named, understood, which transforms them from invisible landmines into recognized patterns that can be observed rather than simply suffered through. This is the actual secret behind people who are rarely affected by anything. It is not that fewer things happen to them. It is not that they have less reason to be upset. It is that they have done the internal work of integration extensively enough that there is simply less unconscious material available to be hijacked. The reactive person has, in a sense, more landmines buried in more places. The integrated person has located and diffused most of theirs. 6. Why your reaction to criticism reveals exactly where you are unintegrated. Let's get specific, because abstraction alone won't change anything. Pay attention to the criticisms that destabilize you most, not the ones that simply annoy you for a moment and pass. The ones that genuinely disturb your peace, that you replay for hours or days, that seem to lodge somewhere and refuse to leave. Jung's framework suggests something specific about these particular criticisms. They are not necessarily more accurate than the criticisms that don't bother you. They are simply touching something you have not yet integrated about yourself. If being called lazy destroys your peace for days, this is worth investigating. Not because the criticism is necessarily true, but because something about it has found unintegrated material. Perhaps a fear that you are not enough. Perhaps a buried belief, inherited from somewhere, that your worth depends on your productivity. If being called selfish sends you into a spiral, this is worth investigating. Not to determine whether you are selfish, but to understand why this specific accusation has so much power over your internal state. Perhaps a shadow that contains a buried, unintegrated permission to prioritize your own needs. One you've never given yourself, which makes the accusation land with disproportionate force. The criticisms that don't affect you reveal nothing particularly useful. The ones that do are, Jung would argue, the most valuable data available to you about your own unfinished psychological work. This reframes the entire experience of being deeply affected by something someone said. It is not simply suffering to be endured. It is information, precise, specific, and almost always accurate information about exactly where your next piece of integration work needs to happen. 7. The collective unconscious, and why some reactions are older than your own life. This is one of Jung's most expansive ideas, and it matters here because it explains reactions that seem to come from nowhere identifiable in your personal history. Jung believed that beneath the personal unconscious, the layer made up of your own repressed memories and experiences, lies something deeper. The collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche shared across humanity, containing patterns, images, and instinctive responses that are not learned individually, but are, in some sense, inherited as part of being human. This explains why certain fears, certain reactions, certain emotional patterns seem to arrive with an intensity that feels disproportionate to anything in your actual personal history. A fear of abandonment so intense, it doesn't seem to match anything specific that happened to you. A rage at injustice that feels ancient, bigger than the specific situation provoking it. A terror of failure that seems to predate any actual failure you've experienced. Ancient. Some of this is, of course, explained by personal history you may not consciously remember. Early experiences, pre-verbal memory, patterns absorbed before you had language to process them. But Jung's framework suggests something additional, that some of what we feel is not purely personal at all. It is participation in patterns that are, in some sense, structurally human, fears and instincts that exist in the species, not just in the individual. The practical implication of this is significant. Not every intense reaction can be fully resolved through personal analysis alone, because not every intense reaction originates purely in your personal history. Some of it is simply the condition of being human, carrying patterns older than your own life, responding to certain themes, abandonment, betrayal, death, the unknown, with an intensity that connects you to every human being who has ever felt the same ancient fear. This does not mean you are powerless against it, but it changes the relationship. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me that I feel this so intensely?" you can ask, "What ancient human pattern am I currently participating in? And how can I meet it with more consciousness than blind reaction?